Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. This week, we are continuing our coverage of last week's Southwest Socialism Conference held by the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We heard from some of the speakers at the opening session last week. Now we are going to hear the keynote speech by Brian Becker. Brian Becker is the head of the Answer Coalition, the national coordinator for the Answer Coalition. That's Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, as well as one of the founding members of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. After that, we're going to hear from Gloria La Riva, who was the 2016 presidential candidate for the PSL, receiving more votes than any socialist party candidate since 1976. Who will be discussing the situation in Latin America with regard to worker struggles there. Without further ado, this is from the Southwest Socialism Conference that took place, put on by the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Albuquerque, New Mexico last weekend.
I wanted to start by just giving you some new news, which is that on Sunday, August 12th, which is next Sunday, a week from tomorrow, the Nazis and KKK who carried out the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville are coming to Washington, D.C. And because they know they have a friend in the White House, they're coming right to the White House. They're coming to Lafayette Park. And people are organizing, including the Answer Coalition and PSL, for a massive mobilization to let them know and let the world know that they're not welcome in Washington, D.C. This is 1 year after one of their ranks murdered Heather Heyer. Scores more were injured. On the run-up to this mobilization against the Nazis and Klan, Facebook shut down one of the Facebook pages of people organizing against the Nazis. And they said that was because they had uncovered that the operation was Russia's robots designed to create divisive issues in America, and they shut the page down. So 3,000 people who said they were going, can't find it. Well, the people who put the page up contacted the media and said, we're not bots. We're humans. We're here. We exist. You can talk to us. And the media did come and talk to them, and they do exist. They live in Washington, D.C. Nonetheless, the page is taken down, again, on the basis that it's Russia spreading socially divisive issues and organizing protests against Nazis in Lafayette Park in front of the White House. This morning, D.C. government officials announced that they are planning to allocate separate metro subway trains so the Nazis and Klans can come to their own rally without fear of having violent confrontations. So here you have the U.S. government, in the name of stopping Russian interference, shutting down pages of people who are actually organizing Nazis, and then raising up the possibility that the Nazis will be escorted by D.C. police and given their own metro trains so they can spew their fascist garbage in the nation's capital. The metro workers will not, the metro workers, subway workers who are predominantly African American will not escort these people by any, and they made that clear today. It's a little small, disgusting, but small incident that reveals what the so-called Russia hysteria leads to. Where here's Dan Coates, the director of national intelligence, and the Democratic Party loves Dan Coates now, even though he was a Republican, because he said 2 days ago, testifying with Nielsen, the Secretary of Homeland Ministry, and Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, all the guardians of our democracy. Dan Coates said, "We continue to see a pervasive messaging campaign by Russia to weaken and divide the United States." So absent any evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, it's now boiled down to this. There's a pervasive messaging campaign by Russia to weaken and divide the United States. So all of us who are fighting for social justice, all of us who are fighting for peace, all of us who are fighting against racism, if we are not Russian agents, we are stooges of Russia because our positions are congruent with those of the Russian government to promote socially divisive issues. We have to understand what the Russiagate is fundamentally. It's had its own evolution or devolution or degeneration. It may have started first as an explanation by the Democrats about how they could possibly lose to the most unpopular politician in American history. That would be Donald Trump. Maybe it started that way, but it has certainly evolved into a Washington capitalist, imperialist, Democrat, Republican, bipartisan consensus position, also dovetailing with a new national security strategy, which now identifies, and this was adopted in January, identifies major power confrontation as the principal priority for the Pentagon war planning, Pentagon budget spending for the next years and decades. And by major power confrontation, we're talking about confrontation with Russia and China, as the comrades mentioned in the earlier panel. Now, does that seem like insanity? Well, of course it seems crazy. How could you possibly be preparing for war against Russia, which has also, like the United States, thousands of operational nuclear weapons? How can you prepare for war against China? 1 out of every 4 human beings in the world is Chinese. And they have a major and developing economic and military power. How could this be in the cards? And I want to talk about why this is. And we're not having this talk because it's interesting. We're a socialist and revolutionary organization. We are building an organization. It's been something we've been all tirelessly doing for 14 years. We believed when we started the PSL in 2004 that there would be a revival of socialism. But if socialism is an abstract concept, or if it's simply an idea, if it's not defined, and if it doesn't have organization, it will devolve into and be co-opted by Democratic Party liberalism, be defanged, and not be a threat at all to the existing capitalist system, which is, in fact, as the comrades mentioned in the earlier panel, the source of the problem and problems that we're facing. So we're building the organization, and we're having the orientation on this because it's about what we do, what we say. What do we say to our coworkers? How do we explain things? Guthrie asked me before the session, what do I think, or what do we think about the Democratic Socialists of America? And I want to raise this point that the DSA, like PSL, like other socialist groups, are growing, and DSA is growing faster and with tens of thousands of members, and they're operating largely within the Democratic Party. So the question will be, for this sort of very optimistic development, people are wanting to become socialists, are identifying with socialists. We have to give definition to what that means, and also what kind of organizational forms can be effective in the coming period. So when we talk about why Russiagate exists, or the new orientation of U.S. foreign policy, it's not abstract, it's not academic, it's not interesting. It's sort of getting ready for what we do in the coming period. So with that said, Marcus made the point in the earlier session about how, since its inception, as a settler, racist, colonial regime in North America, the policy or the foreign policy of the sort of nascent bourgeoisie that conquered North America has always been for exploitation and genocide. Its fortunes were built based on the theft of Indian lands, the genocide of indigenous peoples, and the enslavement of African peoples. I mean, that's about it. That's what made American capitalism exceptional. It was exceptionally oppressive, exceptionally genocidal, exceptionally developed in terms of its ability to carry out the transatlantic slave trade. Now, in that sense, nothing has changed. I mean, we still see many of the same policies. Some of the words have changed. Some of the language has changed. Politicians don't speak the way they did in the 16th and 17th and 18th and 19th century. They're more refined now, except for Donald Trump. and they've altered their presentation, but there's a sort of a fundamental continuity in the system of exploitation, and it doesn't matter whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. So the reason I'm saying that is we want to talk about what is new, what is different, because a lot of it is the same old, but what's new? Because what's new is potentially extremely toxic, malignant, and taking the country in the direction of a new, perhaps World War III, and we have to be alert to what and how that might happen. I was in Iraq in 1998. I was there we had brought medicine to Iraq. The Iraqis were suffering from economic sanctions. 8,000 Iraqis died every month, according to the UN's own statistics. 5,000 of them were children under the age of 5. The other 3,000 were mainly their grandparents. In other words, the very young and the very old, those who were most vulnerable to not having food or medicine, were dying in record numbers. So we brought medicine to Iraq in defiance of the U.S. Clinton, at that time, sanctions regime. And every time we did this, and we did it numerous times, the U.S. government, the Clinton administration said, we're going to arrest you, and we're going to put you on trial, and you're facing 12 years in prison. And we'd say, good. Like, that would be a great trial. You're going to put us on trial for bringing medicine to babies you're killing deliberately as a matter of U.S. policy. Let's see what the American people who don't know about this actually think about that policy. And so each and every time we went, the U.S. government said, well, we wish you well. In other words, changed their idea about arresting us when we weren't afraid of being arrested or afraid of the trial. So I was in Iraq in December 1998. And the Iraqis came in. This was during the era of Saddam. And the people who were hosting us, they came in and said, you have to leave right now. We had just landed in Jordan, driven through the desert in this 14-hour-long drive. We had arrived in Baghdad. They said, you have to go because the U.S. just, under the Clinton administration, just announced that they're pulling out all the weapons inspectors from Iraq, which means that they're going to start bombing the country, and we can't take responsibility for your safety. So we packed up, and we drove through the desert back to Amman. And sure enough, as we were driving out, the U.S. started bombing. And they dropped 1,000 bombs and missiles on Iraq for 4 days. And they said it was because Iraq wasn't cooperating with weapons inspections. Iraq was the most inspected country in human history. But they were bombing them anyway because the Clinton administration had decided to end the facade of weapons inspection and go for regime change. And there was nobody who was prepared to stop the United States. The Soviet Union, as Nino mentioned, had been the erstwhile ally of Iraq, but it was no more. It had disappeared as of 1991. Russia was too weak. Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of Russia, had only been reelected in 1996 because American political operatives with millions of dollars went to Moscow in 1996 and rescued his presidency and brought him to reelection. Talk about meddling in other countries' elections. Right. It was Pete Wilson's political advisors, Bill Clinton's political advisors. The New York Times, the Time magazine has you can look it up on the internet, Yanks to the rescue. It's a picture of Boris Yeltsin holding a little American flag, talking about how the American ruling class saved Boris Yeltsin because he was going to lose to the Communist Party in 1996. So Russia was on its knees. They had a servile leadership. The U.S. could just bomb Iraq, and they bombed it, and they bombed it, and they bombed it. And you know what? They never stopped bombing Iraq from that day, December 12th, 1998, all the way to March 19, 2003, when the U.S. finally carried out the final invasion and destruction of the Iraqi government. 1 million Iraqis died. 1 million of them died. According to the Lancet Medical Journal, 1 million died who would not have otherwise died. More than 5,000 U.S. soldiers died in the Iraq invasion. 30,000 had life-changing injuries. Many more died because of suicide when they got back, because of PTSD. This criminal enterprise was carried out against Iraq, not because Iraq had anything to do with September 11th, not because Iraq was threatening the United States, not because it was threatening its neighbors. It was hobbled, it was sanctioned, it was surrounded. The U.S. did it, and I asked Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff. He was on my radio show on the first episode, actually. I said, why did you invade Iraq? Because he was part of the team then. Why? Iraq wasn't threatening anybody. And he said it was low-hanging fruit. In other words, they could invade Iraq and crush Iraq because they could. And there was no player on the international arena that was going to stop the United States because Russia was too weak. And China's own position, even though it was a rising power, China's position has been not to confront the United States anywhere outside of the Asia Pacific, in other words, in its own neighborhood. The Chinese government, realizing the imperialist and expansionist character of American imperialism, has gone out of its way to take what amounts to almost an appeasement policy for the United States, not confronting the United States on a global basis. Now, after they destroyed Iraq, they expected they were going to go immediately to Syria and to Libya and to carry out regime change against all the other anti-colonial governments in the Middle East because they could, because they appeared to be low-hanging fruit. And this policy continued even until 2011, when the Arab Spring, so-called, began. The U.S. government, under President Obama, along with the British and the French imperialists, carried out the bombing of Libya and destroyed the Gaddafi government. Libya was the financier of the Organization of African Unity. Libya had the largest oil reserves of any country on the African continent. Libya was trying to play ball with the United States, just the way Saddam tried to play ball, and just the way Assad tried to play ball too. But the U.S. didn't care because they wanted to destroy any vestige of the anti-colonial project following World War II, the one that Nino talked about, where the socialist camp was aligned with these national liberation movements and anti-colonial projects. And what did Russia and China do when the U.S. brought the resolution at the United Nations for the bombing of Libya in 2011? It was Resolution 1973. It said the resolution authorized the use of military force so that civilians in Libya could be protected from Gaddafi. What did China and Russia do? They abstained. They abstained, and thus the bombing began. With the fig leaf, the mask, the masquerade of global legitimacy, the UN Security Council making it lawful. At that time, Putin was not president of Russia. There's a lot of speculation, and it's just speculation, that Putin disagreed with the Russian government's position on the abstention on Libya. He decided to re-enter the contest for the presidency in Russia. He won the election. And remember, again, all this time, the United States had been sort of all right with Putin. You know, when George W. Bush in 2001, he looked into his eyes, and he could see his soul, and he liked him. Yeah. And then in 2009, when Obama and Hillary Clinton became president and Secretary of State, You remember Clinton came as Secretary of State to meet Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, her counterpart, and she brought that great big red reset button. They said, let's press the reset button in public to make a better relationship. By the way, they mistranslated in Russian the word reset, so it said overload. So Lavrov was momentarily confused. Why are we trying to overload? But they figured it out. They both pressed the reset button. That was 2009. Still not, it wasn't an act of treason to want to have good relations with Russia. But what happened since Libya is what has caused the change in the international relationship and the reorientation of U.S. foreign policy. And those changes were these. In February 2014, after months of imperialist-backed protest in the Maidan, in Kiev, in Ukraine, what had been the second largest Soviet republic, Russia's principal ally, the site in Crimea of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the largest military base for the Russian military, and Crimea, which had been part of Russia for centuries, and Crimea, which is Russian-speaking and culturally Russian and ethnically Russian, and was only moved to Ukraine in 1954 by Nikita Khrushchev following Stalin's death and during the interim period as an administrative measure because Ukraine and Russia were one country called the Soviet Union at that time. In other words, when under the pressure of these imperialist-inspired protests in the Maidan, the Yanukovych government, which was not a Russian stooge government, was trying to play Russia and the West off of each other, came to an agreement with the United States and with the EU that the Ukrainian police would remove themselves from the downtown of Kiev, from the Maidan Plaza. And the day after the police were removed, Nazi militias supported by the Democrats and the Republicans, staged a military coup d'etat in Ukraine and seized power and created a racist, semi-fascist, anti-Russian government on Russia's border. Remember, from the Russian point of view, Nazi Germany's invasion in 1941 was through Ukraine. 27 million Soviets, most of them Russians, died. For Ukraine to become the place for NATO to establish a hostile anti-Russia, semi-fascist regime on Russia's borders could not be more threatening. And under those circumstances, Vladimir Putin allowed for the people in Crimea to have a referendum where they voted by 96% to affiliate with Russia. Russia was protecting its Black Sea naval base. The people in Crimea never really wanted to be part of Ukraine. They clearly didn't want to be in a Ukraine that was anti-Russian and that was hostile to Russia. They voted. That's a turning point in the contemporary politics. And people need to study what happened at Ukraine and really focus on it and not ignore it. Nothing is more important for Russia than what happened in Ukraine. That was 2014. 2015, what happened? Syria was supposed to be the next Libya, the next Iraq. The U.S. was going to take out the Syrian government and replace it with a stooge regime or just weaken the country. And the Russian government under Putin, having seen what the U.S. did in Libya, decided to militarily intervene in Syria, and it turned the tide. Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the terrorists who are backed by U.S. and NATO and Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they were defeated decisively. And the Assad government stands today, and it will continue to stand. It was the first time that the regime change operations of imperialism were defeated. And this is not to make a political characterization of the Ba'athist ruling party in Damascus or the Assad government overall in Syria. The point here is imperialism wanted to target Syria for overthrow, not because the U.S. cares about human rights, not because it cares about democracy, not because it cares about minorities. I mean, really? The United States going to war because it's concerned about, it has a tender place in its heart for minority peoples? I mean, no, the U.S. wanted to carry out the regime change in Syria for the same reasons it wanted to do it in Iraq or Libya or before that in Yugoslavia, which was to take these geostrategically important and resource-rich parts of the world and include them in an American-dominated sphere of influence. And Russia stopped the U.S. again. It was Ukraine in 2014 and Syria in 2015. And from then on, all of the American political establishment has directed this growing crescendo of animus and hostility against Russia. Here's the reason when you boil it right down. Imperialism thought at the end of the so-called Cold War, when the socialist bloc broke up, that it would be the unipolar hegemon dominating power for decades, perhaps centuries to come, and that no other force could rival them or compete with them. And China, because it's an emerging power, and because Russia is back on its feet, and able at least to defend its interests in its own neighborhood, has seen now by the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies as a fundamental obstacle to U.S. imperialist expansionism. And the fact that Russia and China, who were the two socialist giants in the heyday after the Chinese Revolution of 1949, have found a new unity with each other, not on an ideological basis, because Russia's not communist. And the Chinese foreign policy is not reflective of the old-style sort of Chinese internationalist policies of the 1950s or 60s, but simply on the premise of its own national interest that must be safeguarded. They have united to stop imperialism from carrying out whatever imperialism wants to do. And as a consequence, we have a new stage of global politics, and the imperialists are besides themselves with the idea that there's someone to block their path. It's that simple. All the other stuff about Russia interfering, I mean, look, Putin said the other day when he was with Trump at Helsinki, he said, yeah, I wanted Trump to win because Putin has only one interest, is the U.S. government have a hostile or a friendly relationship towards Russia? Did Putin expect Trump to win? Of course not, because no one expected Trump to win, including Trump. He didn't even run to win. He was promoting his brand. I mean, and he lost. Let's never forget that. He lost by 3.5 million votes. It wasn't Russia. I mean, if there was no electoral college, Hillary Clinton would be president. But the Democrats don't talk at all about the electoral college, which, by the way, is premised exclusively on the old slave system, and the U.S. can't get rid of it, where enslaved people were 3/5 of a human being. The slave owners wanted the enslaved people to be a full person so that they would be counted as for congressional representation. And the northern states said, no, enslaved Africans are not citizens, so they shouldn't be considered people at all. So the wonderful, exceptional American democracy came to an exceptionally wonderful compromise in the American Constitution, describing enslaved people as 3/5 human for the purpose of representation. That's why Donald Trump is president. And also, what about the Facebook ads that Russia promoted, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm in Washington, so we live with this every day. And I have a radio show at Sputnik, so we really live with it every day. But I don't know how it plays in Albuquerque or in the Southwest. But when you look at just the facts, the indictment by Mueller of the Internet Research Agency is that trolling farm in St. Petersburg paid for 80,000 ads, $80,000 in ads, 56% of which came after the election. Most of which had less than 5 views, and none of them talked about any of the candidates. Now, Trump spent $90 million on social media. And you should really go and read how the Trump campaign fine-tuned the use of Facebook and other social media as a gigantic manipulation effort, which of course the Democrats did too, but less effectively. $90 million that Trump spent. And by the way, CBS CEO, predator Leslie Mooms, who should be in jail, he said during the election campaign, this might be bad for the country, meaning CBS's relentless focus on Donald Trump. It might be bad for the country, but it's really good for CBS ratings. And so did CNN. They made Trump a thing. They made this odious, racist, xenophobe, misogynist pig a thing. Instead of what he really is, they could have easily exposed him. And right now, look at what happened this week. Trump is eliminating all protections for clean water, all protections for fuel standards. I mean, they're carrying out a war to drive poor people off of Medicaid. 500,000 people lost Medicaid this week because of Trump's thing. And all you hear from the Democrats is about Russia's pervasive messaging campaign, as if that's the problem with Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is reelected, the Democrats have nobody to blame for themselves, because guess what? Most working class people don't really think the main problem in their life is the Kremlin's pervasive messaging campaign on Facebook. They think it's the fact that they can't send their kids to a doctor when they're sick, the fact that they don't have decent paying jobs, the fact that they don't have affordable health care. That's what people are thinking about. So where is it going? It's about to morph. I'm going to end on this point. We're leaving the Russiagate phase, everybody. It's going to be very heavily focused now on Chinagate 2. Because you can't have confrontation with Russia or China or Iraq or Libya or Syria without thoroughly demonizing the targeted entity. You have to create hatred and fear amongst the people in order to prepare them to accept spending all of their money for a confrontation with other countries that have thermonuclear capabilities. And so you saw, and I could see just by look at the front page of the New York Times every day, you see the rapid evolution. They're actually embracing Trump's hostility towards China now. And they're also preparing to carry out regime change in Iran. They want to carry out regime change in Iran and Russia and China. That's the idea. Too many people in the left, in academia in particular, have talked about the fact that the U.S. is a fading empire, that it's a weakened colossus, that its days are numbered, that the empire will go the way of all empires. Well, you know what? 40 years ago, we said that too, after the loss in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and the victory of the revolution in Guinea-Bissau and Angola and Mozambique, the victory of a revolutionary process in Ethiopia, the uprising of the Sandinistas in 1979 that took power, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Afghan Socialist Revolution of 1978. We all thought at that time, this is clearly the eclipse of imperialism. The empire was ending, but Ronald Reagan came in, doubled the military budget, prepared the country for confrontation with Russia. It was really the second Cold War. This is the third Cold War. And put enormous pressure on Russia. And also, at that time, used China in an anti-Soviet way as a consequence of its own ability to split and divide Russia and China, which I think Trump also wants to do. He was hoping to split Russia away from China. In other words, his pretense about being friends with Putin was an attempt to bring Russia back into a different Western-oriented orbit. That's not going to happen. But when we think about it, when we think about what happened in the 1980s, there was a near confrontation on so many fronts. And finally, the progressive side had internal implosions in the Soviet Union, divisions that arose, fear, division between the Soviet Union and China, where some parts of the Soviet leadership felt envious that China was being integrated into the world economy while they were being sanctioned. We in the PSL should not have a cavalier attitude towards this. we are not just simply, serious about condemning the crimes of imperialism. We have to recognize that the anti-Russia and anti-China demonization campaign is for no other purpose than to prepare for confrontation. This brings me back to the DSA question, because DSA and other socialists who are working inside the Democratic Party and are not challenging the Democrats, trying to create the liberal or left wing of the Democratic Party, all socialists have to be aware of the reality. This is a trajectory that's not going to stop. Can you be in the Democratic Party and not challenge and fight tooth and nail the pro-war imperialist orientation of the Democratic Party towards Russia and China? Can we be socialists and not be anti-imperialists? Can we be socialists and not take aim at the main problem that the ruling class is presenting us as a people? Can we just fight for housing and healthcare and sort of wish the rest of the world went away because it's too complicated and we don't want to get our hands dirty with regimes like Assad or Putin or China or whatever? We can't do that. We live in the belly of the beast. This is the center of imperialism. In 1946, the left thought, oh yeah, the strikes are breaking out everywhere. We certainly are going to have the pamphlets of the Communist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party, the two main left groups in 1946, were things like the coming American Revolution. Well, no, it wasn't the coming American Revolution. It was the coming witch hunt. The Communist Party was decimated because it wasn't politically prepared for what was coming. It had 100,000 members in 1945, communists, people who believed in communism. By 1955, it was driven down to 5,000. It was made into a shell of itself. We have to take all of our organizing with utmost seriousness. We cannot turn away because it's hard. We cannot say, oh, I don't want to dirty my hands with all of these international issues because that will discredit me. We have to do the hard work of explaining to our coworkers that the ruling class is behind this war drive. My favorite slogan from Lenin, which I dropped on the floor here, but I remember more or less, is this, that people will always be the foolish victims of deception or self-deception unless they realize that there is always a class interest behind a policy, a declaration, a religious edict. If we don't understand the class character of politics, we can't avoid deception or self-deception. The PSL's role is to help get rid of deception, to tell the truth, and to expose the class interests of this war drive. It's not enough to be pro-Democrat, pro-Republican, this, that, or the other thing. Let's look at the class interests. 90% of the population in the United States, 90%, that's 300 million people, working people, 90%. The average family income is $30,047. That's the average family income for the bottom 90%. How many people with an average family income of $30,047 are in the U.S. Congress? That would be zero. How many are in the House of Representatives? Zero. How many are in the Senate? Zero. How many are in the Supreme Court? Zero. Our class is not represented in this government. Our class must have its own vehicle, its own voice, its own representation, and expose the class interests of the capitalists who say that they are liberal in one day or conservative in the next. They are imperialists and capitalists. We have to have a Congress that represents the people. We have to have a government that represents the people. And when I say the people, I don't mean abstract people. I mean the 90%. Maybe we can get rid of the 9% under the 1% too. Like, we'll just make it 90. But that's the class that isn't represented in Congress, isn't making the foreign policy, isn't deriving the national security strategy. And if we have that class represented, it would be clearly a class that's for peace, for eliminating the Pentagon budget entirely, all $1 trillion of it, and that's the real number, to make sure that every child has the same opportunities that the children of the 5% or the 1% have. The money is there to do that. We have to liberate that money. We have to use the old expression EWC, expropriate without compensation those who are making war and making profits off of our labor. That's the class character of a new movement. Thank you.
That was Brian Becker, the national coordinator for the Answer Coalition, that's Act Now to Stop War and End Racism Coalition, talking at the Party for Socialism and Liberation's conference, Southwest Socialism Conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico last weekend. Here is another part of a speech from that same weekend. This is Gloria La Riva, who is a 2016 presidential candidate for the PSL, receiving more votes than any socialist on the ballot since 1976, speaking about the worker situation in Latin America. To hear more of these interviews, you can find our show on SoundCloud, Spreaker, and iTunes by typing in People's Republic, where you can find the entire set.
Latin America is not getting much attention in the news of the United States, except to portray the countries in progressive struggle, revolutionary struggle, as basket cases, deserving of U.S. intervention to rescue it, really to rescue the resources for the U.S. That's all you really hear about Venezuela and Nicaragua, blaming them for what the U.S. is really responsible for. But it's not possible to understand what's taken place in either of those two countries without looking at the developments and events of the last 10 years in Latin America, well, of course, before that, from 2009 to 2018. The decade before that, from 1999 to 2009, there was significant movement forward with the election of progressive presidents in several countries, starting with Hugo Chávez's election in Venezuela, which started the Bolivarian Revolution. He was elected in 1998, took office in 1999. Evo Morales became president in Bolivia in 2005. Rafael Correa in Ecuador in 2006. Then Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua was later that year and reelected in 2009. Actually 2011 and 2016. There were also the elections in that decade between 1999 and 2009 of Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party in Brazil and Nestor Kirchner and later his wife Cristina Fernandez in Argentina, which began in 2003. Those two were not socialist, but relatively progressive, and improve the conditions of the working class in their countries. And of course, there is Cuba's steadfastness in defending its revolution for so many years. All of this was taking place in the decade of the 2000s. There was so much progress. And yet now the people of Latin America are experiencing a serious and often violent setback in their countries, counter-revolutionary attacks. And the U.S. government is behind the fostering of that opposition. And of course, James from the Alliance for Global Justice from Arizona just talked about the crisis in Colombia. In recent months, U.S. officials are intensifying pressure on their allies in Latin America against those progressive governments. Former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson appealed to elements within the Bolivarian military to overthrow President Nicolás Maduro, and Trump has threatened military action. Mike Pence's visit to Ecuador in late June was followed immediately by the new right-wing Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno's announcement that whistleblower Julian Assange would likely not be given refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. In the last 10 years, as I said, the government has intensified its efforts, covert and overt, to recover its place of geopolitical and economic domination in Latin America and the Caribbean. U.S. funds are being poured into destabilization campaigns of subversion to reverse the revolutionary turn in the continent. And it's having a serious effect. But despite the most blatant racist and imperialist actions of Trump, this new offensive of the United States against Latin America did not start with his administration. The latest offensive started, in fact, with President Barack Obama soon after he took office in 2009. After all, one of the first actions of his government was to support, if not engineer, the Honduran coup against the president, Mel Zelaya. And of course, Hillary Clinton, being the Secretary of State, boasted in her book of her role in supporting the new coup government until her second edition, when she took that little part out to run for president. Of course, let's not forget, during Obama's first term, the destruction of Libya and the devastating war that began against Syria. The Democrats' role cannot be overlooked, as others have said, or ignored, because as the 2020 election cycle looms before us, even before the midterm elections of November, the progressive movement and working class will be told once again that the only way out of their crisis that we are facing, economic, social, political, is to put aside protest. Don't pressure the Democrats. Work all that you can in the next 2 years. Ignore history and support them to become the new party to rule. But the history of the U.S. and Latin America and the Caribbean, whether Democrat, Republican, has been of military coups, CIA plots to overthrow governments who did not have elections that turned out in its favor, assassinate leaders, all to back U.S. corporate and geopolitical interests. And it was Obama who clearly signaled this new tactical approach in U.S. strategy of domination when he was first campaigning for president in 2008. He gave his Latin America-themed speech in May 2008 in Miami, that city being the seat of the Latin American counter-revolution. In fact, he spoke before the Cuban American National Foundation, the notorious group founded under Reagan's term that was designed to strengthen the policy of strangling the Cuban economy. The foundation also received tens of millions of dollars in CIA funding to carry out terrorist attacks against Cuba. So here was Obama in Miami with this fascist group. And he announced a new approach to achieve the same goal. Here's a telling excerpt from his speech. He said, "Since the Bush administration's action launched a misguided war in Iraq, its policy in the Americas has been negligent toward our friends, ineffective with our adversaries, and incapable of advancing our interests in the region. No wonder, then, that demagogues like Hugo Chavez have stepped into the vacuum. His predictable yet perilous mix of anti-American rhetoric, authoritarian government, and checkbook diplomacy offers the same false promise as the tried and failed ideologies of the present." He means socialism. He goes on, "But the United States is so alienated from the rest of the Americas that this stale vision has gone unchallenged and has even made inroads from Bolivia to Nicaragua. And Chavez and his allies are not the only ones filling the vacuum. While the United States fails to address this changing reality in the Americas, others from Europe and Asia, notably China, have stepped up their own engagement. Iran has drawn closer to Venezuela, and just the other day, Tehran and Caracas launched a joint bank with their windfall oil profits." That's the Monroe Doctrine talking. So when Obama mentioned Hugo Chavez's checkbook diplomacy, he was condemning the idea that a country like Venezuela could control its own resources for the benefit of its people and other peoples and countries, and thus keep it out of the hands of Exxon and other oil giants. Let's not forget that hundreds of millions of gallons for several years were donated by Venezuela to poor communities in New York City, in Boston, and in native reservations during the winters. Why was Obama so bothered by Nicaragua and Bolivia and Venezuela, to mention them? It's because the decade of the 2000s was the unprecedented uniting of governments and countries that were breaking away from the very domination of U.S. imperialism. It hadn't happened before on this scale. By 2004, Venezuela and Cuba had founded the ALBA Alliance, which stands for Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, it meant the member nations of this organization who joined would share resources and human solidarity on an equitable basis. It was Cuban doctors and teachers being sent by the tens of thousands to these countries. In turn, Venezuela provided oil, and other countries provided food. Each year, more countries were inspired to join. With Cuba and Venezuela as the beginning of this organization, in 2006, peoples of Latin America, fed up with cutbacks, poverty, neoliberal programs, responded by electing similar leftist candidates. In that year, Daniel Ortega, who had been a leader of the Nicaraguan 1979 revolution before it was devastated by a U.S. contra-war which killed more than 50,000 people, he was reelected in 2006 with 38% of the vote. In his first term, economic reforms to benefit the population began to turn the economy around, also with the help of ALBA resources. A literacy campaign led by Cuban teachers made Nicaragua the third country in Latin America to be free of illiteracy. The second was Venezuela, with the help of Cuban teachers, and the first was Cuba, of course, in 1961. Ortega's vote, his election, the second time around, grew from 38% to 62% in 2011, and 2 years ago, he won a third time with 72% of the vote, and 5 parties running against him. This is the country that the U.S. has targeted precisely for that reason. And Ecuador? Well, Rafael Correa was elected in 2006 on a platform of challenging the banks, which had enormously increased the country's debts. He was elected the same year as Ortega. His government, called the Citizen Revolution, declared a drastic reduction in what the government would pay to the IMF and World Bank. That's taken on the U.S. Much of the country's income was used instead for social programs, healthcare, education, and poverty was reduced from 36.7% to 22.5% in 10 years. New constitution. But probably what angered the U.S. most about Correa was that the only U.S. military base in Latin America at the time when he was in Ecuador, Manta Air Base, and he refused to renew the lease. It was shut down 3 years into his presidency. And of course, Colombia took up the slack with several military bases being built now. Evo Morales was elected in 2004 and has been reelected since then. What was his crime in the eyes of U.S. imperialism? Well, Bolivia has one of the largest reserves of natural gas in the world, just almost limitless, and oil as well. Before his presidency, the hydrocarbon corporations, mainly U.S., but European too, paid only 18% of the profits to the Bolivian state. A new law changed that and flipped the percentage to the corporations having to pay 82% of their profits to the state. This enabled an increase in pensions, wages, reduction in poverty, schools, and other development. As you may know, Nicaragua's revolution of 1979 was devastated by 11 years of U.S. direct financing of the Contra-War, which killed, as I said, 50,000 people. The aim was to destroy the revolution. More than $1 billion was poured by the U.S. to fund the Contra-terrorists. And finally, after 11 years and the exhaustion of the population, the FSLN, the Liberation Force, agreed to elections, which they lost. And so the right wing had their way for 16 years. Poverty grew. Neoliberalism grew. U.S. domination grew. This is why Daniel Ortega was elected 3 times recently. So what was the supposed reason for the latest outbreak of violence in Nicaragua, which has not happened in years? I have met right-wing Nicaraguans who live in the U.S., in San Francisco, who have been to Nicaragua lately, who even remark positively how much peace there has been in the country and how much development there has been that they have seen. Well, the excuse for the violence was that the government was proposing changes to the pension system in April. For example, lowering future payments, increasing by a small percentage the part that the workers would have to pay into the pension plan, and the corporations had to pay a much higher percentage. The aging of the populations in many countries has put into risk a lot of pension plans. Well, that was the pretext, and suddenly young masked gangs of youth were engaging in violent attacks, burning down buildings, now killing more than 260 people. I know from my own workplace experience with our pension and all the years I worked that young people do not protest the issue of pensions. That's not the first thing on their minds. When I was working, if you were under 40, you were fighting for a bigger wage. When you're over 40, you were fighting for that money to go into your pension. Why were there no older people protesting? Because it was an attempt at a putsch in Nicaragua that comes from the playbook of the CIA, much like the scene of Venezuela a few years ago. Unfortunately, some of the left in the U.S. is buying into the U.S. position, hook, line, and sinker. And this completely mistaken position in seeing people in the street protesting and thinking, well, I identify with that. Well, how can you identify with people who burn buildings and kill? Schools, government buildings. It's a completely engineered plot. In fact, between 2014 and 2017, the CIA front, known as the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, spent $4.2 million that we know of to create the opposition that would overthrow Ortega. But the other day, and you can see in Liberation News on the website that was just posted, an article that shows that hundreds of thousands of people out of a population that's only a few million are in the streets defending the government and their country. What's the unfolding situation as we speak? Luis da Silva, the most popular person, political person in Brazil who would definitely win an election if he were allowed to run, is now in prison, sentenced to 12 years, thanks to an engineered coup against President Dilma Rousseff, who was also expelled, and then the false persecution of Lula. However, in these days, there's a massive mobilization on different fronts of people in Brazil who are running him for president again, even though he's not allowed, who are engaging in all kinds of mobilization for his right to be free. Rafael Correa, who I mentioned before, third-term president from 2007 to 2017, declared the international debt illegitimate, among other things, is now a hunted man. He's in Belgium. And with the right-wing government of this new president, Moreno, this judge has ordered his extradition from Belgium. She's asked for Interpol to arrest him and extradite him to Ecuador. The purpose of it is to prevent him from being a leader again in the country. And it's highly likely that U.S. Vice President Mike Pence issued the dictate for his arrest, since he visited Ecuador 4 days before that order.
That's all we have for this week. You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. Thank you for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.